The rain in Manhattan fell in a steady, rhythmic cadence against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sapphire Lounge. Julian stood in the dimly lit foyer, holding a velvet box containing a vintage Cartier necklace for his wife's 35th birthday. But when the maitre d' checked the exclusive ledger for the private room, Julian's name wasn't there. A glance through the frosted glass shattered his reality. His wife wasn't having a quiet girls' night. She was kissing another man, surrounded by their laughing friends. The perfect marriage was nothing but a beautifully curated lie. If you are captivated by tales of hidden truths and the devastating cost of a double life, stay with us as this story unfolds. The rain in Manhattan fell in a steady, rhythmic cadence against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sapphire Lounge. Julian St. James stood in the dimly lit foyer, shaking the delicate drops from his tailored charcoal overcoat. The ambient sound of smooth jazz and clinking crystal washed over him, a stark contrast to the dreary November chill outside. In his right pocket rested a heavy velvet box, a vintage Cartier diamond necklace. It was intended as a peace offering, a tangible declaration of renewed effort for his wife's 35th birthday. Vivian DuPont had told him that morning, as she flawlessly applied her lipstick in the mirror of their penthouse, that she simply wanted a quiet evening with just the girls from Ashford Media Group. Julian, wanting to be the attentive husband their 7-year marriage desperately needed, decided to surprise her. He didn't intend to crash the dinner, only to pay the exorbitant bill in advance and drop off the gift before heading back to the office. He approached the polished mahogany podium. "Good evening. I'm here to take care of the tab for Vivian St. James's party. Or perhaps it's under DuPont." The maitre d', a man with an impossibly crisp collar and a scrutinizing gaze, ran a manicured finger down the leather-bound ledger. "I'm sorry, sir. We do have a private event in the Velvet Room for Ms. DuPont, but there is no St. James on the approved guest list." Julian offered a polite, practiced smile, assuming it was a simple administrative error. "I'm her husband." The host's professional mask faltered for a fraction of a second. "I assure you, sir, the list was strictly curated by the host herself. Only 10 names. None of them are yours. I am strictly forbidden from allowing unlisted guests into the corridor." A cold, sharp prickle of unease started at the base of Julian's neck. He bypassed the podium before the host could protest, his long strides taking him down the ambient, velvet-lined hallway toward the frosted glass doors of the private dining area. He didn't push them open. He didn't need to. Through a clear, vertical sliver in the architectural glass, Julian had a perfect, cinematic view of the intimate, candlelit table. Vivian looked absolutely breathtaking in a backless emerald gown. But she wasn't surrounded by just the girls. There were couples. Mark Stevens and Megan Taylor from her agency were there, laughing heartily, raising their champagne flutes in a toast. And sitting directly beside Vivian, his hand resting intimately on the bare skin of her lower back, was Lance Silver. Julian stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to ice. Lance leaned in, whispering something against Vivian's ear that made her throw her head back in genuine, uninhibited laughter, a sound Julian hadn't heard within the sterile walls of their penthouse in years. Then, as naturally as taking a breath, Lance leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. No one at the table blinked. Megan smiled warmly at them. Mark took a sip of his wine. It was normal. It was accepted. They all knew. Julian's phone suddenly vibrated in his pocket, a harsh, mechanical buzz that jarred him from the surreal nightmare. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. It was a text from Vivian. "Miss you tonight, darling. The girls are being so loud. Can't wait to come home to you. Hugs and kisses." He looked up from the glowing screen. Through the glass, Vivian was putting her phone face down on the white tablecloth, her eyes sparkling as she turned her full, devoted attention back to Lance. Julian stood paralyzed in the shadows, an uninvited ghost looking through the window of his wife's real life. Julian navigated the elevator ride up to the ivory tower in a state of clinical detachment. The polished mirrored walls of the carriage reflected a man who looked exactly as he had an hour ago. Immaculate suit, perfectly styled hair, stoic expression. But beneath the expensive wool and silk, he was free-falling. The silence of their penthouse was deafening as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him. Usually, he found comfort in the minimalist, ultramodern aesthetic they had curated together. Tonight, the stark white walls and cold marble floors felt like a mausoleum for a marriage that had never truly existed. He didn't turn on the main lights. The city's ambient glow provided enough illumination as he walked past the pristine living room and straight toward Vivian's home office. It was a space he rarely entered. They had an unspoken rule about respecting each other's professional boundaries, a cornerstone of their supposedly mature, high-functioning relationship. Now, that rule felt like a convenient, carefully constructed blindfold. His heart hammered a slow, painful rhythm against his ribs. Part of him screamed to pour a glass of scotch, go to bed, and pretend the scene at the Sapphire Lounge was a stress-induced hallucination. Confronting her meant detonating their lives. It meant severing ties not just with his wife, but navigating the inevitable fallout at Ashford Media Group, where their professional and personal lives were deeply intertwined. But the image of Lance Silver's hand on her bare back was burned into his retinas. Ignorance was no longer an option. Julian sat at her sleek glass desk, the faint, lingering scent of her jasmine perfume mocking him. He began with the obvious drawers, neatly organized files, expensive stationery, corporate contracts. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Julian was a man of meticulous detail, and he noticed a slight discrepancy in the depth of the bottom mahogany drawer. He pulled it all the way out, his fingers tracing the underside until they brushed against a small, flat box taped to the hidden wood. He ripped it free. His breath hitched as he opened the nondescript cardboard container. Inside sat a cheap, prepaid smartphone, a stark contrast to the latest flagship models they both carried for work. Beside it lay a heavy, generic silver key, completely devoid of any identifying branding or building logos. With trembling fingers, Julian picked up the phone and held down the power button. The screen remained black. Dead battery. He quickly retrieved a charging cable from his own briefcase and plugged it into the wall, connecting the hidden device. A small battery icon appeared, followed by the blinding white light of the startup sequence. Julian stared at the silver key in his palm, feeling the cold metal bite into his skin. He was holding the literal key to his wife's double life. The phone vibrated, signaling it had enough power to boot up. As the lock screen materialized, Julian felt the last fragile piece of his reality fracture. It wasn't a generic background. It was a candid selfie of Vivian in bed, her face makeup-free and glowing with a soft, profound contentment, asleep against Lance Silver's bare chest. The harsh backlight of the burner phone illuminated Julian's face in the dark office, casting long, hollow shadows beneath his eyes. He stared at the lock screen until the display timed out, plunging him back into the quiet gloom of the penthouse. The image of Vivian's peaceful, makeup-free face resting against Lance Silver's chest was a violent juxtaposition to the woman Julian knew. His Vivian was armor and angles, impeccably styled hair, designer dresses, and a guarded posture that never truly relaxed, even in the privacy of their own bedroom. Memories of the past 2 years began to slot into place like jagged pieces of a toxic puzzle. He remembered her subtle, physical withdrawals. The way she would stiffen imperceptibly when he kissed the back of her neck while she made her morning espresso. The frequent, lingering migraines that required her to sleep in the guest room for days at a time, claiming she needed absolute, uninterrupted silence to function at Ashford Media Group. The sudden, intense networking retreats that left her unreachable for entire weekends. Julian had interpreted these as symptoms of a high-pressure corporate life. He had been so blind, so eager to be the understanding, modern partner, that he had practically held the door open for her deception. He tapped the screen again. The phone was secured with a 4-digit passcode. He tried her birthday. Incorrect. He tried the date of their lavish Hamptons wedding. Incorrect. A bitter realization settled over him. Her life with Lance did not intersect with the sterile metrics of her life with him. He swiped down on the notification center. The text previews were hidden, but a ride-sharing widget remained active on the lock screen, displaying a recent trip summary. The primary destination was saved simply as home. It was not the address for the ivory tower. It was a specific block featuring pre-war brownstones on a quiet, tree-lined street on the Upper East Side. Julian looked from the glowing screen to the heavy, unbranded silver key resting on the glass desk. The metal felt warm in his palm, heated by his own racing pulse. He checked his stainless steel chronograph. It was barely 10 o'clock. Vivian had promised she wouldn't be back until well after midnight. The women of Ashford Media Group, she had claimed with a playful eye roll, always closed out the bar on birthdays. He could stay. He could tape the box back beneath the mahogany drawer, climb into their cold, expansive bed, and wait for the familiar click of her designer heels in the foyer. He could play the fool and preserve his pristine, privileged world. Instead, Julian slipped the burner phone and the silver key into the inner pocket of his coat. He stood up, turning his back on the meticulously curated lie of his home, and walked out into the relentless Manhattan rain to find the door that matched the key. The cab dropped Julian off at the corner of a quiet, tree-lined street on the Upper East Side. The rain had reduced to a freezing, miserable drizzle, slicking the cobblestone edges of the sidewalk. He stood in the shadows of a large oak tree, his eyes fixed on the elegant, pre-war brownstone that matched the address from the burner phone. The silver key sat heavy in his damp pocket, a silent invitation to a world he was never meant to see. He didn't have to wait long. A sleek Blacktown car pulled up to the curb. Julian stepped deeper into the darkness of the wet foliage as the rear door opened. Lance Silver stepped out first, popping open a large black umbrella. He reached his hand back inside, and Vivian emerged. She didn't look like the poised, untouchable PR executive of Ashford Media Group. She kicked off her wet designer heels right there on the pavement, laughing freely as Lance scooped her into his arms, carrying her up the stone steps to avoid the puddles. Julian watched them disappear through the heavy oak doors. A minute later, the large, uncurtained bay windows on the parlor floor flooded with warm, golden light. From his vantage point on the dark street, Julian had a flawless, agonizing view into their private sanctuary. He watched as Vivian unzipped her stunning emerald gown, letting it pool carelessly on the hardwood floor, a dress that cost more than a car, treated like an absolute afterthought. Lance handed her an oversized, faded gray hoodie. She slipped it on, her hair falling in a messy, damp tangle around her shoulders. She walked into the open kitchenette and hoisted herself onto the counter while Lance began boiling water for tea. They were sharing a mundane, quiet domesticity that she had strictly denied Julian. In the penthouse, their meals were catered, their routines rigidly scheduled, their interactions polished, measured, and polite. Standing in the freezing rain, a sickening realization began to take root in Julian's mind. He remembered the swift, clinical nature of their courtship. Her father, the formidable patriarch of the DuPont family, had essentially engineered their union to stabilize the firm's optics ahead of a massive corporate acquisition. Vivian had signed the ironclad prenuptial agreement without a single question, treating their marriage like a standard business merger. "We make a great team, Julian." On paper, she had told him on their wedding night. He had thought she meant they were an unstoppable power couple. Now, watching her press a tender, lingering kiss to Lance's jaw, he understood the devastating literalism of her words. Julian's own phone suddenly buzzed in his pocket, the screen glowing brightly in the dark. It was an automated calendar alert. Ashford Media Group Annual Gala, tomorrow, 7 p.m. He looked back up at the illuminated window, a cold resolve settling over his shattered heart. Tomorrow night, he would have to put on his tuxedo, link arms with his wife, and smile for the flashing cameras, knowing perfectly well that the man she truly loved would be standing right there in the crowd. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Gallery was a suffocating sea of bespoke tuxedos and blinding diamonds, completely transformed to celebrate the pinnacle of the Ashford Media Group. Flashbulbs erupted like controlled lightning as Julian and Vivian walked the crimson carpet. She was a vision in midnight blue silk, the heavy vintage Cardi, a diamond necklace, the birthday gift Julian had dutifully presented that morning with a hollow, rehearsed smile, resting coldly against her flawless collarbone. She linked her arm through his, her manicured fingers gripping his bicep with the precise, calculated pressure of a corporate asset securing an investment rather than a wife holding her husband. Julian played his part flawlessly. He offered the practiced, charming smiles required of him, shaking hands with industry titans and kissing the powdered cheeks of socialites. But beneath his tailored Tom Ford jacket, his blood was a slow, agonizing boil. Every interaction felt deeply tainted. When Mark Stevens clapped him on the shoulder, offering a jovial, booming greeting, Julian felt the phantom sting of the laughter he had witnessed through the frosted glass of the Sapphire Lounge. Megan Taylor complimented Vivian's Cartier necklace with a syrupy, lingering smile, entirely complicit in the grotesque charade. They were all seasoned actors on Vivian's stage, and Julian was the only one who had never been handed a script. Then, the crowd parted near the towering champagne pyramid, and Julian saw him. Lance Silver stood near a marble pillar, nursing a glass of amber bourbon. He wasn't looking at the powerful executives or the lavish, carved ice sculptures. His dark, unreadable eyes were locked directly on Vivian. For a fleeting, microscopic second, Vivian's professional mask slipped. The tight, polite smile she had worn all evening softened into something raw, private, and incredibly vulnerable. She subtly adjusted her grip on Julian's arm, a silent, agonizing signal across the crowded, glittering room. Julian tracked the exchange, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. He wanted to cross the marble floor, shatter the crystal glass in Lance's hand, and tear down the heavy velvet curtains of their high society lie. But doing so would only make him the erratic, jealous husband. He needed total, undisputed control. Later in the evening, as Vivian was cornered by her formidable father, the patriarch of the DuPont empire, Julian hovered near a towering floral arrangement, catching a fragment of their hushed conversation over the soaring string quartet. "The merger optics are holding steady," her father murmured, his tone icy and strictly transactional. "Ensure Julian signs the offshore trust addendums by Monday. We cannot afford any deviations from the original arrangement. You know what is at stake for your real future." The original arrangement. The words echoed violently in Julian's mind, aligning with the sterile prenuptial agreement he had signed 7 years ago. A sudden, chilling clarity washed over him. He excused himself from the ballroom, citing an urgent international business call, and headed straight for his private suite at the Ashford Corporate Tower. He needed to unlock the encrypted financial drive hidden in his office safe. The executive floor of the Ashford Media Group Tower was a silent, glass-walled ghost town at this hour. Julian bypassed his own corner office and used his master access card to enter the firm's secure archives room. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note, masking the frantic, uneven rhythm of his breathing. He moved straight to the secondary biometric safe, a vault Vivian's father insisted upon for sensitive client data. Julian, as a senior partner, had clearance, though he had never once felt the need to inspect the DuPont family's private holdings. Until tonight, the heavy steel door clicked open with a soft hiss. Inside sat a single, encrypted titanium flash drive. Julian plugged it into a standalone terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he bypassed the initial security protocols using the corporate master key. He navigated through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts until he found a hidden folder labeled Project Ivory. He clicked it open. The screen illuminated his face in a harsh, blue glare. It wasn't a standard prenuptial agreement. It was a meticulously drafted corporate contract, signed and dated 7 years ago, 3 months before he even met Vivian. The document outlined a strategic alliance designed to stabilize the DuPont empire ahead of a massive international merger. They needed a man with an impeccable social pedigree, an Ivy League background, and unblemished corporate acumen. They needed Julian St. James. But the most devastating revelation was in the appendices. There were NDAs signed by Mark Stevens, Megan Taylor, and a dozen other close friends. And there, Buried in a subclause regarding a designated trust fund was the name Lance Silver. The text swam before Julian's eyes as he read the cold, legal jargon. Lance and Vivian had been together for years before Julian entered the picture. Lance, a man with no pedigree and massive debt, was deemed an unacceptable liability by the DuPont patriarch. The arrangement was brutally simple. Vivian would marry Julian for a minimum term of 10 years, securing the merger and producing the necessary optics of a high-society power couple. In exchange, a multi-million-dollar offshore trust would mature, allowing her and Lance to live in permanent, untouchable luxury once the contractual divorce was finalized. Every anniversary dinner, every carefully curated vacation, every fleeting moment of supposed intimacy between Julian and his wife had been a billed hour. The frequent migraines and weekend networking retreats were contractually allotted times for her to inhabit her real life on the Upper East Side. He wasn't a husband. He was a highly compensated corporate shield. Julian leaned back in the leather chair, the silence of the room pressing against his eardrums. The agonizing heartbreak he had felt outside the Sapphire Lounge instantly evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. He didn't just want a divorce anymore. He wanted to burn the theater to the ground. He printed the master contract, folded the crisp pages into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket right beside the heavy silver key, and pulled out his phone. He typed a single message to Vivian. "Leave the gala. Meet me at your home. The real one." The ride back to the Upper East Side brownstone felt entirely disconnected from reality, as if Julian were watching a stranger direct the cab driver. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the cobblestones glistening under the amber glow of the street lamps. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't hide in the shadows of the oak tree. The heavy silver key slid perfectly into the polished brass lock of the front door, turning with a smooth, decisive click that sounded like the final nail in the coffin of his marriage. Julian pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the warm, dimly lit foyer of the parlor floor apartment. He didn't bother to remove his wet overcoat. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the living area, followed by the clinking of two glasses. He walked silently down the short hallway, the thick Persian runner absorbing the heavy thud of his Italian leather shoes. When he stepped into the archway of the living room, the tableau froze. Vivian was still wearing the stunning midnight blue silk gown from the Ashford Media Group gala, but the heavy Cartier diamond necklace was discarded carelessly on a side table. She was curled comfortably on a worn velvet sofa, her head resting on Lance Silver's shoulder. Lance was dressed down in dark jeans and a simple black t-shirt, pouring a measure of amber bourbon into a crystal tumbler. They were laughing at a private joke, completely unaware that the architect of their heavily subsidized reality was standing in their sanctuary. "I imagine the bourbon tastes significantly better when you aren't paying for it, Lance," Julian said. His voice was dangerously calm, shattering the intimacy of the room like a gunshot. Vivian gasped, practically leaping off the sofa. Her eyes, wide and panicked, darted from Julian's cold, unreadable expression to the heavy silver key dangling from his left hand. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her porcelain skin ashen. Lance stood up slowly, placing the tumbler on the coffee table with a deliberate, heavy thud. He didn't look surprised, only resigned, his jaw tightening as he squared his shoulders. He instinctively took a protective half-step in front of Vivian. "Julian," Vivian breathed, her voice trembling in a way he had never heard during their 7-year marriage. She raised her hands in a placating gesture, completely abandoning the poised, untouchable PR executive persona. "Julian, please, just listen to me. It's not what you think. I can explain everything." "Oh, I believe you can, Vivian," Julian replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out the thick, folded sheaf of papers. He tossed them onto the glass coffee table. They landed with a heavy, final thwack right beside Lance's bourbon. "But I think Project Ivory has already explained it quite thoroughly. 10 years for a full payout, wasn't it? I'm afraid I'm terminating your contract 3 years early." The silence in the Upper East Side apartment was absolute, broken only by the sharp, panicked intake of Vivian's breath. She stared at the Project Ivory documents resting beside Lance's bourbon, her eyes wide with a terror Julian had never seen her possess. The impeccably composed PR executive, the untouchable heiress of the DuPont empire, was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman watching her meticulously constructed, multi-million-dollar house of cards collapse into ash. Lance finally moved, breaking the frozen tableau. He reached down and picked up the thick sheaf of papers, scanning the first page with a slow, heavy resignation. He didn't look angry. He looked defeated, a man who had known this day would eventually arrive. He dropped the contract back onto the glass table, turning to look at Vivian. "Julian," Vivian stammered, taking a hesitant step forward, her hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. "Julian, you have to understand. It was my father. He gave me no choice. If I didn't secure the merger, if I didn't marry a man with your pedigree, he would have destroyed Lance. He would have ruined him financially and professionally." Julian felt a cold, bitter laugh rise in his chest. "So you sold me, Vivian. You sold 7 years of my life to buy your freedom. Every dinner, every vacation, every time you looked at me and said you loved me, it was just a heavily subsidized performance. You turned my entire existence into a billed hour." "It wasn't all a lie," she cried out, tears finally breaking free, streaking down her porcelain cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. She reached out, trying to grasp his arm, but Julian stepped back, the physical revulsion clear in his posture. "I care about you, Julian. We built a good life together. A partnership. We can still have that. We don't have to change anything. My father doesn't have to know. We can just keep going." Lance scoffed softly behind her, a sound of profound disgust. "Jesus, Viv. Listen to yourself." Julian looked from Lance back to his wife. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the sheer, unadulterated terror of losing the immense wealth and social standing that the DuPont name provided. She wasn't fighting for him. She was fighting for the offshore trust fund, the penthouse, the vintage Cartier necklaces. She was begging to keep the golden cage she had built around him. "You really think I would stay?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying calm. "You think I would continue to play the fool, smiling for the cameras at Ashford Media Group galas, while you run back here to the man you actually love?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the generic, heavy silver key, tossing it onto the table beside the contract. It landed with a sharp, final clatter against the crystal tumbler. "I'm not your employee anymore, Vivian," Julian said, the words tasting like absolute freedom on his tongue. He looked at Lance, offering a slow, grim nod. "She's all yours, Lance. I hope she was worth the wait. Because tomorrow morning, I'm filing the divorce papers, and I'm sending a copy of Project Ivory to every member of the Ashford Media Group board." Vivian let out a choked sob, falling to her knees on the thick Persian rug, her midnight blue silk gown pooling around her. She reached for the documents, her hands trembling violently. Lance didn't move to comfort her. He just watched Julian, a silent acknowledgement of the destruction they had both wrought. Julian didn't wait for her to speak again. He turned his back on the elegant parlor, the heavy oak doors, and the 7 years of beautifully curated lies. He walked out of the apartment and into the freezing Manhattan night, the rain washing the remnants of his old life away with every step. The dawn broke over Manhattan with a fragile, bruised light, casting long shadows across the sterile white marble of the Ivory Tower penthouse. Julian St. James stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the waking city. The storm had finally passed, leaving the skyline washed clean, sharp, and unforgiving. He hadn't slept. He had spent the final hours of the night methodically packing his tailored suits, his vintage watches, and the few personal artifacts that hadn't been carefully curated by the DuPont family's interior designers. His phone had buzzed relentlessly for the first 3 hours. Missed calls from Vivian. Frantic text messages from Mark Stevens and Megan Taylor, demanding to know why he had abruptly abandoned the Ashford Media Group gala. A single, ominous voicemail from Vivian's father, the tone carefully neutral but laden with unspoken corporate threats. Julian had silenced the device, placing it face down on the glass desk where he had found the burner phone just 24 hours ago. The silence that followed was heavy, not with the comfortable quiet of a shared life, but with the profound, echoing emptiness of a mausoleum. He picked up the thick manila envelope resting on the kitchen island. Inside were the expedited divorce filings, meticulously drafted by a ruthless, independent attorney he had retained at 4 a.m. Attached to the legal documents was a secure USB drive containing the unredacted Project Ivory files. He had already scheduled the courier to deliver identical copies to the Ashford Media Group Board of Directors at precisely 9 a.m. He wasn't asking for alimony. He wasn't demanding a share of the offshore trust. He simply wanted the absolute, irrevocable destruction of the contract that had bound him. Julian walked slowly through the penthouse one last time. He looked at the perfectly arranged designer furniture, the expensive abstract art, the flawless, sterile kitchen they had never cooked in together. It was a beautiful, multi-million-dollar stage set, and the play was finally over. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, not for Vivian, but for the 7 years he had spent believing he was building a genuine partnership. He mourned the illusion of the man he thought he was, a beloved husband, an equal, a partner. He stopped at the marble foyer table, near the heavy oak doors. He looked down at his left hand. The platinum wedding band caught the pale morning light, a heavy, expensive shackle he had worn with pride. He slid it off his finger. The skin beneath was pale and unblemished, a stark physical reminder of the time he had lost. He placed the ring deliberately in the center of the cold marble surface. It landed with a soft, final clink, resting right next to the velvet box containing the vintage Cartier diamond necklace he had intended to give her at the Sapphire Lounge. Julian picked up his leather duffel bag, the weight of his entire real life slung over his shoulder. He opened the front door, the hinges silent, and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. He didn't look back at the penthouse. He didn't need to. He pressed the elevator button for the lobby, watching the digital numbers descend. "You can keep the illusion, Vivian," Julian whispered to the empty air, the words a final, quiet benediction to a life that never existed. "But you no longer get to keep me."